Okay, well, it's 2 o'clock according to my clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for attending this session. This is a general Appalachian Studies session around the theme of language and culture. And so we have 4 presentations today, and we're asking each presenter to stick to about 15 minutes. And we'll see what time permits, if we'll do some oral questions after the presentations. Please feel free to liberally use the chat. You can access that by clicking on the word balloon above the feed there. If you want to write comments or write questions, I'll look at the chat throughout and read questions if there is time after each presenter is finished. So we're going to start with Lynn Caldwell at Ohio University. And oh, by the way, my name is Michelle Maroney, and I'm at Ohio University as well. And I'm going to facilitate today. And I'm going to ask each presenter before they start just to say a few words about themselves and, who they're affiliated with and whatever else you want to say, what your dog's name is, I don't know. So we'll go ahead and get started. Lynn, I'm going to stop sharing the slide, and you can go ahead and put your slides up and take it away.
Great. So as I'm getting set up, I'm going to introduce myself very quickly. I am an alumni from Ohio University, just finished my bachelor's in linguistics, and I have done a deal of research in sociolinguistics, bilingualism, and historical linguistics. Okay, let's go to, view, present. So today I will be speaking on the research that I recently did regarding Appalachian phonetics in southeastern Ohio. So past research done on Appalachian Englishes and predominantly the phonetics of different forms of Appalachian English or Appalachian English associated phonetics didn't really focus on southeastern Ohio, and the majority of research that was done on southeastern Ohio's language contact with Appalachian English or Appalachian Englishes was predominantly focused on attitudes and perceptions rather than actual language use and change. However, in a past conference that was done in 2018, there was some focus on the phonetic differences between Athens City and Athens County residents, identifying the language change there and the language contact there as a result of the Ohio University. Through the use of the language use survey as conducted by the Southern Ohio Language Project, which is affiliated with Ohio University, I was able to utilize data that they graciously allowed me to use from their language use survey, in which collects different forms of data. So they collect data on the use of different phonetic features, syntactic features. They look at perceptions and attitudes as well. And for the sake of this study, I decided to predominantly focus just on the data that was collected regarding phonetics. So the research questions that I had moving forward were, is there a significant difference in the Appalachian English associated usage between those who are from southeastern Ohio in comparison to those who are not? Which Appalachian English associated features have a significantly higher usage in southeastern Ohio, and which mainstream American English associated features have a significantly higher usage in southeastern Ohio? I hypothesized that the Appalachian English associated features would not be as frequently used among participants from outside of southeastern Ohio as they would be from inside southeastern Ohio. I also hypothesized that the Appalachian English associated features would be used significantly more frequently than mainstream American English associated features by the residents of southeastern Ohio. I hypothesized that the pin-pen merger would be the most prevalent or most frequently used Appalachian English associated feature used by southeastern Ohio residents. And I finally hypothesized that the word Appalachian, pronounced as Appalachian, would be the most prevalent or frequently used mainstream American English associated feature used by southeastern Ohio residents. From the survey, I was able to pull data from 52 participants, in which the age range was between the ages of 18 and 62, with a standard deviation of 9.81. Of these participants, 20 identify as male, 31 identified as female, and 1 did not indicate their age or their gender, sorry. From the Southeastern Ohio group, identified as SE, there were 29 participants, and outside, the outside group, marked as OS, had 23 participants. The actual survey itself and the data that I collected from it had multiple different segments that were divided based on first demographics and then the type of feature being utilized or studied. So I took data from first the demographics section, which consisted of 2 forced choice questions identifying gender and whether or not the person was a native Ohioan, and then 3 open response questions that allowed them to give their age, their hometown, and identify what region of Ohio they lived in for at least 2/3 of their life, meaning that they have been surrounded by the language for at least 2/3 of their life. From the phonetics segment, I took from the phonetics segment, there were 8 forced choice questions with answers coded as either Appalachian English Associated or Mainstream American English Associated. The questions being, when you say greasy, how does it sound? Do male and fell rhyme? Do pin and pen sound the same when you say them? When you say roof, what does it rhyme with? And then it has the 2 different options of rough or woof. And then when you say creek, does it rhyme with? And it either has seek or sick. And then does the second half of Appalachian rhyme with Latchin? Or does the second half of Appalachian rhyme with nation? And finally, do pale and male rhyme? From the regional stratification between the 2 different groups, I had coded each as between each different variant, and then created a sort of score in which if someone used Appalachian English, they got, shall we say, a point out of 8. So when looking at the Appalachian score frequencies, we see 1 being they used only 1 feature that was Appalachian English associated out of all 8 questions, and 8 being they used only Appalachian English associated features. So with the Southeastern Ohio group, the majority of the group really was about halfway, either answering with 4 Appalachian English associated features or 5 Appalachian English associated features. And then we see with the outside group, more on the lower end of the scale, but still predominantly either being between 2 answers or 4 answers that were coded as Appalachian English associated features. We do identify that we had 1 individual from outside of Southeastern Ohio that utilized all 8 features. However, even though we've determined this participant to be an outlier, I still went forward with utilizing her data just to sort of look into whether or not she was straight up just an outlier, or if there was any other information that might have been presented to look further into why she might have utilized all 8 features of Appalachian English Association. From these, the descriptives, as I kind of said before, the mean for the Southeastern Ohio group was 4.66. The outside group, their mean was 3.22. So seeing that just from first glance, it kind of looked like the Southeastern Ohio group used more of the Appalachian English associated features. I then conducted an independent t-test and found that there was a significant difference found between the groups comparing the usage of Appalachian English associated features. A further post hoc analysis indicated that there was a significant enough power for the t-test to be conducted adequately. I then looked at a feature analysis in which I observed the specific features used by the Southeastern Ohio group. We see a great deal of variation in the particular usages, and it should be noted that while there were some that used Latchin, which was assigned as the Appalachian English Associated variant, a lot of people also utilized the mainstream American English associated feature as well, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. Looking at this data, what exactly does this mean? Well, the most frequently used Appalachian associated feature was pronouncing Appalachian as if, well, as I just said it, Appalachian rather than Appalachian. And the most frequently used mainstream American English feature was producing creek in a way that rhymes with seek, as I just said, creek. So when looking at the regional stratification, it seems to imply that those who live in southeastern Ohio sound more Appalachian than mainstream. However, this might be a result of the great variety of regional demographics in the outside group. We had a great deal of people who identified from as far as Cincinnati or Cleveland, all the way over in Toledo, and some people in Columbus. So we had people from all over the state. And it is curious to note, though further studies would have to be done in order to really look at this sort of shift in language use and contact between the two different variants, whether or not regional mapping had any effect on this sort of language use and frequency. I then, like I said, mentioned earlier that there was the outlier, and we did identify that she identified herself from all the way up near Cleveland. And unfortunately, the limitations of the survey didn't really give us any more details about why she might have utilized more Appalachian English associated features than any other participant. So we did determine that she is an outlier, although her data did not seem to skew the results that were conducted. The other thing that was noted was that there were only really two southeastern Ohio regions represented in the data, Athens County and Lawrence County. These did support the findings of the previous research, and it suggested that perhaps the closer somebody is to Appalachia or the U.S. Inland South, the more likely they are to use Appalachian English associated features. However, the differences in between who was within these two different regions seem to also have a stratification of age. People who are older seemed to be utilizing not only more features, but they seem to be from Lawrence County, which is closer to the Inland South and Appalachia than Athens County. Additionally, with the feature analysis, I noticed that there were several participants using both variations when pronouncing the word Appalachian. And this suggests the potential of code switching, though unfortunately the survey does not particularly hint at or give insight to how this might be or if this is even a factor. I did consider the fact that, especially given perceptions and attitudes towards Appalachian English or Appalachian Englishes, that there might be code switching going on. Further research might be able to look into this, but unfortunately the limitations of my research could not give more insight as to why both variations were being utilized. Only one participant utilized creek as if it rhymed with sick, so crick. And this really suggested to me that an Appalachian Ohio designation or being located within southeastern Ohio does not necessarily indicate a propensity for utilizing these features, these Appalachian English associated language features. So it might be that an association with the culture or the people or the community within different areas of Appalachia really might be a stronger indication for whether or not somebody is going to utilize different elements of Appalachian English or Appalachian Englishes. Another thing that this participant really provided sort of a question for further research is how far either south or how far east does one have to travel before certain features start becoming more relevant or more frequently used? Of course, like I said, with the limitations of my study, I wasn't really able to find any insight to that, as only one participant utilized that feature, but it did propose a question for future research. And there's no really clear insight on feature stratification based on which region they were associated in, which begs the question for future research of whether or not we might want to go into specific cities or specific counties and investigate how they're using specific features to see if there is feature stratification or if there are differences in which features are prioritized or which features are more commonly used in different regions of southeastern Ohio.
So you have 1 minute.
Yep, I'm almost done. The final thing that I want to bring up is that as a pilot study, this doesn't really fully represent the region, and it lacks the insight provided by attitudes and perception, as I only collected the quantitative data. However, the study does highlight various patterns and preferences utilized inside and outside of southeastern Ohio, and it does highlight various areas for future research. So my hope is that from this point, we might be able to move forward and learn more about how people in southeastern Ohio are utilizing Appalachian Englishes or Appalachian English associated features. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynn. We do have time for one oral question. If somebody has a question or wants to make a comment, all you need to do is raise your hand. If you don't want to do that, I encourage you to write comments or questions in the chat. I do have a hand raised, and that would be Deborah. What's your question, Deborah? You need to unmute.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. You're welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for that interesting paper. I was wondering if I'm sorry if I missed this, but is your definition of Appalachian English more broadly regional definition, or is it focused on that area of Southeast Ohio? Because it seems to me there's a lot of variation within the region.
So this is a really great point, and it was actually brought up when I submitted this paper for publication that my definition of Appalachian English or Appalachian Englishes when I originally did this study and started working with the data back in 2019 became outdated. So I'm actually going to be spending some time revisiting this and revisiting my definition. At the time, I was using a much more broad definition, sort of determined by Labov and a few others to kind of look at Appalachian English as a more broad sense and looking at the major phonetic features. But moving forward, I do plan to sort of focus the gaze more into the region in particular and to look at it specifically from the Appalachian English that is prevalent within southeastern Ohio. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, Deborah, thank you very much. We don't have time for other questions, but like I said before, I encourage you to continue this in the chat. And Deborah, I'll just ask you to put your hand down. Thank you. You have to click it again to put it down, or I'll just keep calling on you for the rest of the session. Okay, so the next presenters are Dr. Kirk Hazen. I'm sorry, Kirk, I should have asked how to pronounce your last name, and Samantha Barney, and I'm going to be running the slides for them. Okay, and all you need to do is just let me know when you want me to advance the slides. Okay?
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So I'm Samantha Barney. I'm an undergraduate at West Virginia University studying English, French, and linguistics, and I am co-presenting today with Dr. Kirk Hazen, who's a professor of linguistics here at West Virginia University, and we are presenting today on variable crescendos and teenager identity. Next slide, please. We examined the sociolinguistic variables during dynamic discussion in teenage focus groups in a rural northern Appalachian school. We also assessed how all of these variables rise and fall together during dynamic focus group discussions in order to better determine the choices teenagers make in crafting their sociolinguistic identities. For the focus groups, we listened to interviews that occurred between 8th graders and 2 interviewers. They were in 5 separate groups based on how the students identified socially. The goal was to listen to natural conversation between this age group and see how they interacted with their peers. In this way, we could see them use language more naturally opposed to individual interviews where they may change their usual speech. Next slide, please. Sociolinguistic interviews are designed to foster relaxed conversation between an interviewer and a research subject. The interviewer may ask about how communities have changed over time, social groups in the community and schools, and about the subject's future plans. Focus groups are different in that 3 to 4 research subjects are prompted with questions to play off each other. An interviewer might ask about something specific like wacky farm stories or something general like how the community is changing. But if things go well, the subjects will play off each other and language variation patterns and narratives will influence each other. Our focus groups also contained a section at the end of each one where the interviewers played speech samples from southern West Virginia in order to get the hillside students' reactions to different dialect regions and to get them talking about their own speech in the contrast with areas like Morgantown. For the individual interview, social factors like gender did not show any significant statistical patterns. For the focus groups, gender and academic orientation did matter, and we will show some of those results. Speakers with positive academic orientation produced 3 times the amount of ing tokens than those with negative academic orientation. Gender also correlated with the rates of vernacular variance and the usage of any tokens produced by a speaker. Before we continue with the presentation, it is important to note that the only speech features that were mentioned by the students as country were vowel-related rather than ing variation or leveled was. For example, the students noticed ion gliding in words like mile, but did not identify phrases such as they was as country. Next slide, please. In traditional sociolinguistic interviews, participants answer questions and their interviewer attempts to elicit some form of continuing narrative from the participant with a goal of maximizing speech. Overall, the interviewer generally guides the progression of the discussion. Focus groups are a different kind of discourse environment. Each student had a lavalier microphone on to record their speech, and a room microphone was also recording. The focus groups were done in a conference room at the Hillside School in the spring of 2018, approximately 6 months after the individual interviews. The students themselves were about to end 8th grade and head to high school, a topic that weighed heavily on their minds. Participants play on each other in order to develop their next thought of speech, often overlapping and building off each other's speech. The amount of speech at any one time rises and falls with greater speed and volume than do traditional sociolinguistic interviews. Next slide, please. In a speaker's language usage, social factors may influence a speaker's use of certain language features. While a speaker explores their identity, they craft their language, whether this craft is conscious or unconscious, after features that they believe reflect themselves or their community utilizes. During this time, a speaker may turn towards or veer away from vernacular features that they or other speakers outside of their community have stigmatized. Of course, stigmatization does not always mean that a speaker will avoid a feature. Some speakers reclaim the feature as their own to show how it is not a negative part of language. In this focus group, stigmatization affects how these 19 speakers understand themselves and navigate their spaces inside and outside their community. Next slide, please. Based on these focus group discussions, the country accent is stigmatized not only in the outside world, but in their academic lives. Students with more of a country accent tend to speak less and correct the way they talk to fit a more standard English variety, particularly the female students. They navigate themselves outside of the spaces in which the country accent is suggested to inhabit. For example, one female student, Hillside 19, discusses how she tries to change her speech and describes her English as beyond bad, which stems from remarks made through other speakers in her focus group that point out her supposedly bad English. Another speaker even interjects to describe her English for her. Though these descriptions of her English are inaccurate, the social implications of her English prompts her to consciously change her language to conform to the standard of English accepted by her peers. By changing her vernacular features, these negative connotations no longer apply to her language and thus her identity. Next slide, please. This student, Hillside 7, is identified by other members of her focus group as a yuppie, but she does not self-identify as one. She also discusses her travels and lack of shared cultural experiences with the other focus group members, such as shooting hunting rifles. In addition, she highlights the role of sports in her life as an important identifying characteristic.
Whenever I go up to Connecticut, like, because my stepmom's family lives there, my cousins always make fun of me because I have an accent, but I don't think I do.
Some of her relatives reside outside of the state, and Hillside 7 does not identify with her peers as necessarily country or share some similar cultural experiences. As a result, Hillside 7 may be more aware of the speech patterns of the intrinsic country group by examining the group through a somewhat extrinsic lens. This lens provides her with a different perspective, almost as if an outsider of this social group. Overall, she has a heightened awareness to better recognize these stigmatized patterns. Next slide.
In the individual interviews, Ing was determined as diachronically stable, as it was in the 20th century in Appalachian, and has been found to be in every study since the beginning of the 20th century. Key examples of Ing variation include I was sleepin' with the progressive and sleeping is good with a gerund. What was found previously in the West Virginia region of Appalachia is that progressives had 3 times the rate of alveolar nasals, so sleepin', than the velar nasals with the gerunds. And stylistic and social constraints fell out as expected in the individual interviews. In the next slide. So these were the individual interviews, and we see the social class divisions with the working class having higher rates of alveolar nasals, and with the middle and upper class, the males having higher rates than the females. In the focus groups, in the next slide, please.
I did advance. Is not the right slide?
Should be this up. Here we go. So with here, one of the important factors in the individual interviews was academic orientation. And here we can see that negatively oriented students had higher rates of alveolar ing, especially females. I will say with the positive group, there's one person in each gender. So that one positive academic oriented male who had higher rates is reaching over to more of a country accent with that higher rate. Next slide, please. And here with the academic orientation, we can see again that the negative academic orientation in the focus groups is higher, and that this is clearly a powerful factor in guiding language variation, both for the individual interviews and when they have more free-flowing discussion in the focus groups. Next slide, please. Leveled was is an ancient factor in English that's been around since the very beginning. An example is something like they was fixing a car, and it's called leveled because you have was across the entire verb paradigm instead of a was were split. In Appalachia, there's been a steep decline in the rates of leveled was since World War II. The one exception is with contracted was, things like I was out late last night, which has either been holding steady or slightly on the rise, possibly because of its camouflage form. Next slide, please. In the individual interviews, academic orientation was, again, a big correlating influence on leveled was, with those students with negative academic orientation having higher rates of leveled was. Next slide, please. In the focus groups, we're presenting you a table instead of a graph because it's important to point out that there were no instances of leveled was except for the negatively oriented female speakers who had 40%. So these female speakers are setting themselves apart quite distinctly with this higher rate. The males overall, if you notice, their ends, their numbers of tokens are low, and it may be that they do have it, but they simply did not talk very much about their past tense, about past events, which may be an indication of their narrative structure. Next slide, please. Quotatives in the focus group. Quotatives are those elements that introduce quotes. These have become a hot topic within sociolinguistics because of the rise of quotative be like in examples like, it was like, oh, absolutely not. This has seen a rapid rise in Appalachia for speakers born after 1960, just like every other place in the world. And specifically for quotative be like, ambiguous context and imitation, what's called mimesis, favorite. We have found in previous research that quotative be like has been led by northern upper middle class females, but that quotative zero has been a foil for younger males against this quotative be like. Next slide, please. In the individual interviews, somewhat different play for the role of academic orientation. Here, negative academic orientation has lower rates of quotative be like compared to the positive and the neutral. Females do lead across the spectrum, however. Next slide. With the focus groups, the females also lead, and negative oriented boys have dropped quotative be like completely here. So this is both an orientation, to some extent, a social class, but also a gender divide for quotative be like, to be sure. Next slide, please. One thing to point out here is if you take a look at the bottom row, it's not just that females have higher rates of quotative be like, they have many more tokens. Overall, the young males have dropped using quotatives in their narrative structure completely, which is a change in how to get the job done. Next slide, please.
Then,
You have about 1 minute.
okay. So in this slide, we will play a sample of the focus group interaction to get a sense of how they characterize being country and the impact of the speech believed to indicate that countryness.
I usually, it's not like completely changed. Like some stuff I still like talk country like. I just tried to change it up a little bit because it was like beyond bad when I used to do it. Like it didn't even sound like English when I talked. It was gibberish.
Hillside 5 describes Hillside 19's English as gibberish because of her country accent. Because of this stigmatization of her speech, Hillside 19 does not speak as often as Hillside 5 and Hillside 15, which are the two girls in the group that seem to use language adhering to the standards set in the school. Next slide, please. And here are our conclusions. Next slide. The focus group interviews displayed that gender and academic orientation influenced vernacular variants, such as ing variation, leveled was, and quotative be like. Regarding leveled was, female students with negative academic orientation used this feature the most. Male students with negative academic orientation did not use quotative be like at all in their speech. Students with negative academic orientation used ing the most, specifically female students with negative academic orientation. The students' social identities influenced their own speech and perception of other speech. The students with stigmatized speech could identify the features that did not conform to the standard of the community. For example, Hillside 19 identifies the weird features of her speech. whereas the students without stigmatized speech could not identify the features of their speech that are associated with Southern dialect. For example, Hillside 2 critiques West Virginian speakers, but uses their self, an Appalachian dialect feature. The significant difference between the positive and negative academic-oriented students may be a result of a lack of trust from those with negative academic orientation because of the criticisms rural communities receive about their speech from outside the community. The stigma may have led them to produce less vernacular variants, using more standard speech than they would normally. Next slide, please.
Do you have the next slide? Because I advanced it.
No.
We would just like to thank the people that have made this presentation possible, past WVDP members, and thanks to the NSF and REU supplement for funding. A special thanks to co-PI Dr. Audra Slocum. And for more information on the WVDP, you can visit us at dialects.english.wvu.edu. That's it.
Thank you very much for that presentation, and just want to let the audience know that the reason why I had to do the slides is because there was some sound in there, and for Microsoft Teams Mac, the Mac computers don't work with sound, so I apologize if it was a little clunky. We have time for one oral question. If somebody has a question or a comment, they want to raise their hand. Otherwise, again, feel free to use the chat liberally to carry on a conversation. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much for that presentation. Really interesting.
Thank you.
Okay, so our next presenter is, are you ready to roll, Zeta?
I am indeed, Michelle.
Okay.
My screen share box is blacked out at the top. Is that bad?
It's blacked out.
Like
Next to the leave button?
grayed out. It's grayed out as though I can't.
Okay, hold on a second. Maybe I don't have you listed as a presenter.
I don't think I am. I tried to send you a message, but
okay.
You know, Teams.
Okay, try it now. There we go. Very good.
Cool. And can you all hear me okay?
I can hear you fine. And just introduce yourself and you can start going whenever you're ready.
Cool. Well, I'm Zeta Kamara. I'm at the University of Kentucky. And in a dramatic plot twist, I am not a linguist. I am an archaeologist of the recent past. And I study gender, class, and consumption in Central Appalachia. So my paper is entitled Life in the Valley of Pottery, Appalachian Trendsetters and the Consumer Revolution. So Appalachia is a real place, but it's also a construction of the imaginary. Since its so-called literary discovery in the late 19th century, the region has been forged through discourse, representations of a strange land full of peculiar people, making Appalachia an essentialized construction. Appalachians have been fascinated with Appalachia as a geographic and cultural anachronism ever since, a backwards place that serves, as Emily Satterwhite says, as both a romantic and horrific departure from the normative. Hillbilly stereotypes about a white, poor, isolated, uneducated, and willfully ignorant region frankly sell. And culture brokers focusing on Appalachian Kentucky, like J.D. Vance, trade on a history of problematic representation. So given the region's diversity, what continues to sell this narrative of a place out of step with modern America? And I argue material culture plays a starring role, that the evocative semiotic potential of material culture has always enticed us to use it as a symbol proving otherness. But material stuff is also an active, agentive player in regional construction. So sensational material representations have helped construct Appalachia as a region of need, specifically by proving the region lags developmentally in terms of market access and cosmopolitanism. Appalachian residents and their material environments have been largely portrayed through poverty, and discourse construction cultural retardation has largely imagined primitive homes marked by either a paucity or an excess of consumer goods. And popular and academic understandings have largely held that tastes, ownership, and acquisition of mass-produced consumer goods have been largely dictated by economic scarcity and outside influencers. Material studies from archaeology construct the region differently. Appalachian women consumers, both rural and urban, were integral to the market economy, and they drove the consumer revolution alongside the rest of the nation during the industrial age. Ceramic dishes abounded, becoming central to the desires, decor, and dining practices of American households during the China mania of the early 20th century. Oral history interviews and archaeological excavations of Town Dump in the coal mining town of Jenkins in eastern Kentucky reveal both the flamboyance and the humility of ceramic dishes and consumer agency. Dishes sparkled in china cabinets and humbly framed meals, entangled in the mutual constitution of class, taste, and modernity. So the Appalachian Regional Commission defines Appalachia as 420 persistently impoverished counties across 13 mountain states. Eastern Kentucky's Appalachian counties occupy land traditionally stewarded by the Cherokee, Shawnee, Yuki, and their ancient indigenous ancestors. This paper discusses archaeological artifacts, oral histories, and archival research collected from a company-owned coal mining town in the Pine Mountain area of Letcher County. Jenkins, company era circa about 1910 to 1947, was a model town built by the Consolidation Coal Company. Just as novelist John Fox Jr. was writing of Pine Mountain as a reluctantly acculturating agrarian hillbilly oasis, coal companies were consolidating their diverse labor force of local mountain whites, European immigrants, and African Americans from the north into urban extractive communities. And these diverse people had one glaring thing in common. They were consistently positioned in early 20th century rhetoric as ignorant children who must be uplifted by outsiders. So these new wage laborers could not enter the workforce as modern Americans if they were anti-modern, reformers argued. Now, how did reformers know they were anti-modern? Why? By the goods of their homes and the way that they used them or didn't use them. So immigrants had a taste for outdated Victorian frippery, lavishly gilded dishes with far too many pieces, and they ate from them abhorrent ethnic foods. White mountaineers didn't possess many dishes at all and knew nothing of table service, to be expected from a people who were completely isolated from fashion and ate only the humblest of foods. So the arguments went from social reformers and observers. But if dishes were fishes in Appalachia's early 20th century, everyone swam in riches. Ceramic dishes are a really good entry point into consumerism and the role of material goods and deficiency narratives in regional construction. So the dishes I'm discussing today are from the Shop Hollow dump excavated in 1994. I analyzed this huge collection while interviewing surviving residents. This is a neighborhood level analysis. Trash was collected weekly from curbside cans and dumped in unoccupied haulers. The refuse likely hails from the Lakeside District for salaried employees and officials, the Downtown Commercial District, including a restaurant and hotel, and the Downtown Residential District for white, immigrant, and Black mining families. Families included both salaried and waged consult employees, both men and women, so a range of economic means, classes, races, and ethnic backgrounds. The ceramic assemblage is both incredibly cosmopolitan and delightfully average. It ranges from cheap, plain white granite dinnerwares and easily combined sets or open stock pieces that could be individually ordered, to expensive porcelain teawares with hand-gilded and painted designs. And most pieces fall in the middle, so affordable to most American consumers of the day. All the dishes are quite modern. There is nearly no time lag between the date of manufacture and the deposition in the ground. So Jenkins residents had their finger on the pulse of natural fashions, and they had the means to acquire it. Residents' market access was diverse and staggering. Dishes could be purchased from company stores for cash or scrip. They could be purchased from private stores in East Jenkins, from traveling salespeople. They could be acquired as promotionals for buying tea or other dry goods. And very importantly, from mail order catalogs like Sears and Montgomery Ward. Was this level of market access the norm? Maybe not, but most coal town residents had access to most of the same goods. And it's also important to note that archaeological studies of 19th and 20th century farmsteads and residential sites, so about over 3,000 across eastern Kentucky, just do not find families cut off from the market or from national tastes. Could you find a house so impoverished that their suite of consumer goods was limited? I mean, sure, just like you could anywhere in America, but the exception was not the rule. Appalachian folks always had modern stuff, and like the kids say, they knew which drip was fire. So the U.S. Experienced a consumer revolution between the 1880s and the 1940s that placed myriad goods within the reach of lower and middling economic brackets. And ceramic dishes abounded, especially from American producers who were able to offer more for less due to tech advances in mass production. And dishes became really integral to the desires and decor and dining practices of American consumers. Historian Regina Blaszczak calls this the era of China mania, when the desires and motivations of shoppers were diverse, but consumers all enthusiastically courted pottery and glass. And residents had not only a strong connection with the market, but considerable finesse in shopping for and using these objects of desire. So unlike the Victorian era, where marketers defined good taste and they persuaded consumers from the top down, so like elite taste for all who could afford, these turn of the century advertisers and researchers and retailers and suppliers and designers responded to consumers' tastes and produced a spectrum of designs for broad audiences. And middling tastes were fine tastes, and Americans across the spectrum used dishes to craft aesthetic and functional modern homes. So dishes grace the china cabinet, a new decorating trend, but they also set the ordinary table. Jenkins residents had extremely cosmopolitan tastes in home goods and purchased and used refined whitewares that encapsulated modern trends. The wide variety of trendy, affordable dishes available to Jenkins residents allowed them to pursue and shape this national china mania. So I want to discuss two decorative types of refined white earthenware at Jenkins: decal prints and undecorated white dishes. The assemblage is really diverse, and oral history interviewees shared the consensus that people bought what they liked, and they combined them creatively. Wages at Jenkins for all labor classes were at or slightly above national averages for coal communities. So meaning most popular large piece decorated sets would have been less than 1% of even an underground miner's annual income. The hottest fashions were well within reach. Economic scaling, based on Thomas, 1988, suggests that residents had high purchasing power, but many residents seem to have favored trendier, less expensive white granite dishes for dining. Many of the dishes don't exactly match, but they are so similar in pattern and shape that they suggest combination to build a unified aesthetic. So pink floral decals were among the most popular American patterns, and Haviland and Homer Laughlin's Pink Moss Rose promoted themselves as the gold standard. However, knockoffs were too numerous and accessible to count, and clearly a Pink Moss Rose by every other name smelled just as sweet to Jenkins consumers. So we got these pink and green floral decal patterns, which allowed every consumer to bring trendy pops of color into their home and participate in what Blaszczak calls the domestic color revolution. A lot of these decal patterns were sold in whole dinner or tea sets rather than open stock, but they looked similar enough that replacing them likely meant another modestly priced set, supplementing them with these during this very impressive 40-year run in popularity. My favorite piece is not a pink floral, though. It's a Gentil Bluebird, which is an insanely popular, short-lived pattern meant to inspire happiness through its symbology and trendiness through the new blue color popular for kitchens. The pattern disappeared from the market by 1930, but it was produced by over 300 potteries in East Liverpool, Ohio alone, the ceramic district that revolutionized modern production and is, I would like to point out, in Appalachia. Bluebird dishes provided super cheap color pops and revealed the trendiest development of Jenkins, the Woolworth pioneered model of 5 and dime retail. So the Jenkins Company stores formerly modeled their window displays after Barney's in New York, actually, but this archival photo is revealing. 5 and 10 stores during the early 20th century radically aided in the democratization of things by enabling consumers of even modest incomes to participate in the craze for decorated dishes, including, farm wives, mill girls, and industrial community residents. So 5 and 10 stores also wooed rural and immigrant women. Dime store crockery was not of poor quality, though, because women simply wouldn't stand for it. Bargain dishes were an easy way to participate in the new American preoccupation with color harmony, a marketing psychology advancing the emotional influence of home decor. So dishes were a cheerfully arresting means of renovating everyday meals and the home in line with these desires. And Jenkins consumers pioneered bargain style along with a very chromatically expansive nation. So most of the Jenkins shirts, however, are white. Plain dishes and white dishes decorated with relief and scallop rims, like this one here, were popular, and they were often used for everyday meals, as with the Bluebird sets. We tend to ignore the plain stuff in archaeological analyses, honestly, but plainness is stylistic. Following Margaret Wood, I argue that the use of plain dinnerwares emphasized an intentional aesthetic that transcended frugality. The stark white pastes and clean lines of plain and minimally molded shapes embodied modern scientific householding, which makes sense in a community with high scientific literacy. The importance of whiteness really cannot be overstated during the Progressive Era. I mean, white graced hospitals and medical uniforms and countertops and refrigerators and other home furnishings. And white pastes and clear glazes were advertised in parallel ceramic industries as the most sanitary choice for modern homemakers, specifically countertops, sinks, toilets, and refrigerators. So white dishes, I think, had social capital among informed domestic scientists, with names like Snowflake White referencing visual and microscopic cleanliness. Dish consumption connected Jenkins residents to national reform movements in medicine and home aesthetics, demonstrating material cosmopolitanism once again. So Jenkins consumers with the wages and access to purchase contemporary ceramic trends were the consumers driving them. They were not simply recipients of more refined tastes from outside the region. So dishes created, a pleasing, sophisticated aesthetic that fit new routines of socializing and eating. And dishes clearly had semiotic and aesthetic properties, but it's also important to consider practice. So family dinners, like here, were at full swing at this point. The informal dinner service was the new ritual of dining. And Bourdieu argues that objects have the ability to implicitly condition actors while acting as the primary means by which they're socialized, suggesting dishes weren't merely important because of what they signaled about consumers' desires and realities, but were also constitutive of identity on an unconscious level. So taste and etiquette were socialized through eating from them. Repetitive use bred internalized conditioning, tastes and dispositions acquired through this discursive action and unconscious practical mastery. And also, following Goffman's frame analysis, I'd say dishes serve as the frame for food. They present consumables while making their consumption possible. Sometimes they were very conspicuous and ornate, framing foods and brightening china cabinets through these decals befitting of a fashionable consumer in the age of chromatic decalcomania. But often, they faded into the background. They became a sparse sanitary platform for everyday meals. So Jenkins residents both courted the approval of peers and the desire to produce warm, friendly, modern, and stylish spaces within the home, but they also developed these tastes through consumption, shaping cosmopolitan home fashions through action, along with the rest of America. So,
You have a minute, Zeta.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Setting the table and doing class were thus very inextricably bound. So archaeology really has a chance to shine in app studies. Thousands of us work in the region, but beyond noting the geographic borders, largely don't situate our work in understanding the region's socio-historical construction as an imagined geography. But materials resist. I mean, they confront. Their durability combined with the stories of residents, they really empower us to create place, beyond hillbilly elegies. We can imagine just futures if we acknowledge nuanced pasts. So as we painstakingly refit broken plates and cups, we really do produce Appalachia for national consumption. And representation might lead you to believe that Appalachia has no middle class. When John Dominus, famous photographer, entered Eastern Kentucky with his camera to shoot President Johnson's war on poverty, he very faithfully shot homes that upheld the poverty trope. Like you see here, a mother providing as best she could with mismatched dishes, but, it's not much. And the photos that accompanied this piece, the piece was called Life in the Valley of Poverty, and it showed a real family, and these were their real things, and they were poor. But, as Alan Bateau says, audiences consuming essentializations like this are already betrayed. But, materials resist, and archaeologists tell. And we need to keep encountering materiality in Appalachia and thinking not only about how things shape identities through daily practice, but also how things help us craft the entire region. So I'll say welcome instead to Life in the Valley of Pottery.
Thank you very much. There is one question in the chat.
Sure.
Deborah Thompson really appreciate your nuanced interpretation of Eastern Kentucky consumer culture. And wanted to know where have you accessed your historical photographs?
Oh, that's a good question. Most of them in this presentation are from a collection of over 4,000 glass plate negatives that are in the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. So because this was a model town, they had an industry photographer that documented it from 1910 to 1947, and they were particularly interested in the built world. And also, a lot of those photographs are in UK's special collections, so our archives here at the University of Kentucky. I know they're spectacular, right? It's almost like an embarrassment of riches as a historical scholar.
That's great. Thank you so much. There is some other comments in the chat for you to look at and respond to if you feel. I love the chat feature because it's great to see all the affirmations. People who might not have come up to you after a session are giving you a high five, giving everybody high fives. Okay, so our last presenter, I apologize, I don't know how to say your name. Subhi?
Yeah, that'll work.
Okay.
Subi.
Okay, so you can share your slides whenever you're ready and just do a quick self-introduction, okay? And I will let you know when your time is expiring.
Thank you, ma'am. My name is Subi Hindi. I'm an instructor, an adjunct instructor at the University of South Carolina, Union. I graduated from the University of Houston with a PhD in rhetoric, composition, and pedagogy. And I've been interested in the Appalachian literacies for the longest. Ever right before my dissertation, I guess the year before my dissertation, I got interested on account of my in-laws being from the region originally. And I remember my mother-in-law telling me that, yeah, a lot of Appalachian students seem to be struggling, and they need some kind of they need for their literacies to be validated. In high school, she was referring to because she works in elementary school, but I was in college, so I was trying to like find happy medium. So I thought about doing it for my dissertation, like studying how to incorporate Appalachian linguistic elements in college, but it didn't pan out. So I just worked with my first year writing students at the University of Houston. Can you all see my video in addition to my slide, to my PowerPoint? Because I can't see my.
We can see your PowerPoint and we can see your video as well. You're all set.
Okay, that's cool. So today I'm talking about a composing strategy in college writing. It's one composing strategy that I did my whole dissertation upon. It's a composing strategy of code meshing, where students code mesh elements from their different linguistic heritages, from their different rhetorical traditions in order to do different things, to perhaps appeal to a target audience, to validate where they come from, celebrate their community affiliation, to make a political statement, that sort of thing. So I'm not gonna, I'm gonna be talking about this a little later down the road. I'm gonna see how much I can get through here. So first, I'm going to start with a little bit about Appalachian literacies. A lot of people have done qualitative work with Appalachian literacies. They didn't really do much work with language. It was mostly the overall like literate traditions, and yeah, it didn't do that much with language, and it didn't do much with academic prose either, or the kind of college writing that Appalachian students or Appalachian identified students would do in their college writing. There is a class that I found at Berea College where an instructor by the name of Dr. Jamila Brooks, she made it a requirement upon her students to incorporate their Appalachian rhetorical traditions and linguistic elements in their writing. So that's the only class that I know of that kind of incorporates Appalachian linguistic elements into college writing. First year writing 1 or 2. I think I'm not sure which one that was. It's been a while, but yeah, I found that they're very interesting because I looked online and that's all I was able to find. I talked to her, and I hope to also interview the students, but that didn't pan out. Okay, so I think this kind of strategy is one way to kind of empower minority literacy students. To me, Appalachian students are a minority in the sense that they have a very unique, distinct language or rhetorical tradition. So this is by introducing code meshing, that would be one way to help students kind of celebrate where they come from, use language in the ways they see fit. And it's one way to kind of transition them easily into college from their lives pre-college, if you will. So here I talk about my interest in Appalachia. It's one way to empower non-mainstream students. If you think about it, academically, Appalachian students are non-mainstream students. They don't have the same resources as other mainstream students. So it's not because they're white. They would get everything easily necessarily. They should not be branded as mainstream. That's my argument here, based on their heritage or based on their color. Okay, so a writing class that avails out of code meshing would be very helpful to this class of students. It would help to put an end to linguistic shaming, as Roshana Shantiang puts it. It kind of ensures that their proficiency in their native dialects is not wasted away, according to Son. And it's also one way to use one's language as a resource as opposed to an impediment to one's social and linguistic progress or academic progress. The earliest stab at incorporating language difference in the writing classroom was the Students' Right to Their Own Language Resolution by the Seas, 1974. So, but it was kind of, it was a good move in the right direction, but it was highly critiqued because it was more of a tolerance. It was more of a tolerance move than like a celebration or promotion move. And Kanigaraja kind of critiqued it on two counts. First, it was one of tolerance and not a promotion. And second, it didn't really focus on other dialects of the English language. It primarily focused on African-American vernacular English, Ave and Chicano English. Kanigaraja cites Speaker Elbow that allowed the students to code mesh, not necessarily Appalachian students, any kind of students, to code mesh in their academic writing, but he would not allow them to keep their code meshing elements or retain these in the final draft. Kanigaraja went a step further, and he allowed his students to code mesh elements from their different linguistic traditions, whether they're like forms of the different forms of English language or their own their other languages besides English. Okay, so a big figure in the field is Dr. Roshana Shantiang. He's also a big important scholar in the field where he's where he kind of did most of his research on the incorporation of African-American vernacular English in academic writing. And he's cited different examples of scholars, politicians, and different school children in his book, Other People's English, Code Meshing, Code Switching in African-American Literacy, where he explained the theory and he brought in a lot of examples, provided some pedagogical framework for teachers to use in their courses. And he here has an example of a code mesh tweet, if you will, where Senator Grassley tweeted to President Obama while he was in Paris about healthcare and stuff. So this is an example of code meshing where a politician code mesh to a president using like maybe abbreviated lingo or some kind of shorthand discourse community, if you will. So that's also discourse community. That's also my argument that we should allow our other discourse communities to be celebrated and to be meshed into academic prose or standard American English in college writing. Here is an example of scholar Geneva Smitherman code meshing from African American vernacular English with academic English. See, the scholars or different people have code meshing varying levels. At this point, I don't necessarily want to go like all the way out, maybe 5 to 20% tops of code meshing elements into college writing. But some people might go like 90%. They might code mesh 90% of their article or less than that, depending on where they come from, or the different points they want to make all throughout. Okay, so I did my dissertation on that, and I've come to learn that people or students, first-year writing students, they code mesh for different reasons. It could be rhetorical, because they want to appeal to a different audience, a particular community member or a community itself. They want to personalize their writing, or it could be they want to make a political statement, or they want to celebrate where they come from. It's a way to validate their affiliation, their like cultural affiliation, could be occupational affiliation if they want to like incorporate something from their job lingo, if they want to incorporate something from medicalese, legalese. So it's not only different languages and different dialects, but it could be different discourse communities. Okay, so here I have examples from my students where they code meshed. I have a student here that code meshed from Korean. You can see how he code meshed, and I saw that operating at different levels. I see it operating at the rhetorical level where he's trying to tell the reader where he comes from, but it also operates at the personal level where he's also trying to personalize his writing, talk about the literacy sponsorship that he's received because of while he was studying English. I also have an example here from one of my other classes where one of my students also code meshed, and I saw that code meshing element from Vietnamese operating at 3 different levels: rhetorical level, personal level, and political level. He was talking about red tape, and he incorporated something from Vietnamese, talking about how the development of casinos in Atlantic City, New Jersey, was blocked by Bang Du red tape. So he talked about that, and I read that as a rhetorical move operating at 3 different levels. It operates at the rhetorical level, personal level, because he wants to establish his connection with the community; political level, maybe because he was critical at the local policies that were getting in the way of developing casinos or reopening casinos. So why is this my preferred approach for incorporating Appalachian linguistic elements in first year writing? So I come in as an ally, since I'm not from Appalachia, but I come in as an ally, a la Nathan Shepley's, a la Nathan Shepley, who also writes about Appalachia as an ally to the region, as opposed to somebody from the region or affiliated with the region. Okay, so I also say here that I see it as a way to end linguistic shaming, as a way to celebrate where somebody comes from. So, okay. So I'm thinking of this course that's themed on Appalachian, but it also uses Appalachian themes, incorporates them into academic writing. And this is what these are elements that I hope students to incorporate in their academic writing. Students Appalachian identified, or students from Appalachia, living in Appalachia, I call these Appalachianisms, and they operate at different levels. I see them operating at 3 different levels. I'm gonna have to go through the slides because I think I'm running out of time here. So I see these Appalachianisms working at 4 different levels: lexical, syntactical, orthographic, and phonetic levels of discourse. So these are elements that are specific to people in Appalachia, or people of Appalachian descent, people that are affiliated with Appalachia.
You still have 5 minutes. You still have 5 minutes.
See, I can't see anything but the PowerPoint presentation, so I'm sorry.
I will let you know when you have a minute left.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I have examples here of Appalachianisms. Here I have an example of a lexical feature of Appalachian literacy, where instead of, for example, an Appalachian student has the choice of using something from their linguistic repertoire, from their lexical linguistic repertoire, as opposed to using something that's popular in mainstream American English. For example, gum up as opposed to mess up, for example. That's at the lexical level. At the syntactic level, they might use something like might, could, instead of might be able to in a sentence, and they should not be marked down for it. I'm talking about incorporating that in college writing. Or they could also use orthographic features like spellings that are specific to the region or Appalachian literacies or where they come from, right? So holler for hollow, for example, feller for fellow, and that kind of thing. And I also see it operating at the phonetic level, where they can also sound out how certain things are said in Appalachian English, and instead of like spelling it the mainstream way, if you will, or the dominant way. So here I argue that it helps students' rhetorical and critical literacies when you incorporate these Appalachianisms, or when you allow students, their writing instructor, to incorporate these in their writing. Here I have an example of what it would look like, an example of a text that's code meshed with Appalachian elements. It goes something like, reflecting on the status of his home community in Appalachia, John addresses the effects that mountaintop removal has meted out on the residents of his county. Quote, Dad, blame it. Things were a lot better before and Biggity Peckerwoods from corporate America started gumming up them hollers, which left a heap of mountain citizens plumb riled, pert nigh poor, and most importantly puny, unquote. The residents of John's local community in Appalachia have for powerful long suffered varying states of being unsatisfied, strapped for resources, and I can't see that part. Oh, poorly. Okay. So that's an example of what it would look like, and the instructor should not take off for that kind of code meshing, because it does a lot of things for the student. Okay, moving on. Okay, so code meshing here. There are two types of code meshing. There's code meshing that the student incorporated by incorporating the quote from his community member, and there's code meshing in the analysis text that the student offered in his commentary on the quote. There are two different kinds of code meshing here, if you will. So I designed poorly at that, like an online translator where it's like some kind of pedagogical accessory where you can type in something in academic English or standard English and it'll generate something in Appalachian English. This is still work in progress. It has been for quite a while, so it's not in full, so it has a lot of problems. But I think it's one way to help maybe somebody give some suggestions if they wish to code mesh something. If they wish to code mesh their academic text with something in Appalachian, from the Appalachian tradition, that's one way to do it. I know it's not perfect. I have all kinds of disclaimers and caveats about it, but it's intended to help students do like write in this sort of way, in the academic sort of way, but code mesh with elements from Appalachia, linguistic Appalachia, rhetorical Appalachia. So it's one way, but I do understand it's not accurate. I do understand it's not perfect. And I have here an example of what it would do. For example, if you type in something like in standard English, the fellow from the hollow over there might be able to do it and not mess up like you guys did. It would generate something like the fellow from the hollow over yonder could do it and not gum it up like y'all done. So that's, I think, perhaps an extreme example, but that's what it will give you if you put in these words, right? But that's an extreme example because not everybody in Appalachia, like I explain here in disclaimers, caveats, not everybody in Appalachia is going to replace every word in standard English with a word they know in Appalachian English, right? So
Okay,
I do
now
understand
you have 1
that.
minute. You have 1 minute left.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So this is one possibility. There are a lot of possibilities, and I always say if you wish to code mesh, if you're not a native speaker of Appalachian English, and you wish to code mesh in Appalachian, your text with Appalachian features, you definitely want to check with live sources from the region. And I do understand that not everybody in Appalachia is going to use yonder for over there or like gum up for mess up. I understand that it's not always the case. So this is not accurate, but it's one way, like a step, if you will, poor step on my part to help, code mesh academic English or academic prose or college writing with elements from the Appalachian tradition. And yeah. So
I will
yeah,
cut
I
in.
always
I will
say
cut in right now. I will cut in right now because we are running low on time, and there is one question in the chat that I'll read to you if you can answer it. And that is, to what extent do you think a fear of prejudice might influence students to code switch entirely instead of code mesh in their writing?
okay. So they're talking about they're fearing some kind of stereotype, and there's that fear of like somebody coming across as see, there's a difference between code meshing and code switching. Code meshing is more like it's not every other sentence. It could be in the same sentence you have elements from academic English and Appalachian English. So it's in the same sentence you have that, right? With code meshing, yeah, there's like maybe you have a paragraph or a paragraph or a sentence in Appalachian English and another sentence in academic English, but Rashana Shantiong argues that does not help, that does not validate the other language that you're incorporating. So you should make sure to do it all in the same breath. If you even the same phrase, you can code mesh at the sentence level, at the phrase level. So yeah, there's that fear of some people like maybe essentializing or making fun, but that's, I mean, that is a justified fear, but it shouldn't stop us from making sincere attempts, if I understood the question correctly.
Okay, there's
But
also, if you go to the chat when there's some discussion going on in the chat, so I encourage you to take a look at the chat and to contribute to the discussion and answer additional questions in there. Thank you very much for your presentation. As we wrap up this session, I just want to remind everybody that tonight there is a special film screening and discussion, The Corbin Expulsion of 1919, which is a documentary about race riots in Corbin, Kentucky. There's going to be a panel to discuss that film as well, and that starts at 7 o'clock this evening, and there is a link in your program. And then also, I just want to thank everybody for participating throughout the past couple of days, and we still have a full day tomorrow. and a partial day on Sunday, so that I hope you have a chance to attend additional sessions over the next few days. The chat will continue. If for another, you can keep communicating in the chat, but other than that, I want to thank our 4 presenters and everyone for attending this afternoon.